Hi, everybody. It's Mary Rowe from Canadian Urban Institute here for another installment of City Talk. Thanks for joining us. If you saw that holding slide just now, you'll know that we are 8 days in our countdown to COVID 100. Week from tomorrow, we will have been living with COVID, at least since the WHO declared an emergency for 100 days. And CUI is working with partners across the country to highlight that sort of milestone and figure out where we're at, do a kind of check-in on where cities are at in Canada at that 100-day mark. So we hope you'll join us. If you can go to covid100.ca, you'll see what we're up to. And it's sessions like this across the country being convened by locals and talking about local issues. And so maybe you want to spend the day with us because we'll all learn a lot about what's going on in urban Canada. These broadcasts originate in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg and the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat peoples, and it's now home to many First Nations and diverse peoples, First Nations, Inuit, Métis, from across Turtle Island. And Toronto was also covered by Treaty 13, which was signed by the Mississaugas, with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties that were signed with multiple Anishinaabeg nations. And we're on a journey together here to kind of try to come to terms with the historical legacies of exclusion, not just in terms of Indigenous, but also all BIPOC people in Canada, and all the ways in which we're learning and trying to, as I suggest, address and come to terms with what the obligations are for people engaged in urbanism, building cities, planning cities, designing cities, working in cities. And yesterday, we had a city talk that was hosted by Jay Pitter, where she directly addressed this and talked with colleagues from Canadian and urban planners and activists from Canadian cities and American cities about anti-Black racism and how that has to be addressed in the practice of urbanism and in our conversations even about urbanism. And this one today is an appropriate one to follow. It's in partnership with Park People Canada, and it's really about equitable access to public space and public parks and public places. And we're all having these conversations at a time when public space is becoming the dominant way that people express their lack of satisfaction with the way in which our cities have been designed and planned and resourced, as people continue to express their outrage on the streets in cities all around the world. So we're very happy to have this group here, these four here, to join us today to guide us through a conversation about how we come to terms with that. These conversations, we were just saying in the preview, these conversations are not the end, they are only the beginning. And so we encourage you to continue to talk with each other and with all of us using the hashtag CityTalk, but also for us to think thoughtfully about what are the tangible next steps that each of us needs to take, our organizations need to take, how our work needs to change, how we teach, how we train. All those things are having to be rethought. And COVID's been a particle accelerator for every aspect of urban life that was dysfunctional or not working before. And that is so true in this domain as well. So that's why we are having these conversations, and we appreciate people coming on. All the previous city talks are posted at canurb.org, and that one yesterday posted. This one will be posted. And we usually get them up at about 12 hours. And the other thing is that there is a chat function here. So those of you that are tuning in, please use the chat. We're all Zoom pros now, so you probably know all about it. Just direct your comments, though. When you put a comment on the chat, please direct it to panelists and everyone, because lots of people in the chat end up talking to each other, and you often answer each other's questions. And so it's a really valuable thing. So, but as we say, this is not like Vegas. What you post in the chat stays in the chat, because we post the chat on the internet, on the website tomorrow. So we look forward to having a really robust conversation, both with people on the chat and people here. So you four, thank you very much for joining us. A really timely topic. Your practitioners working in various ways around this issue of equitable access. And I want to thank you for coming on. And I think what we'll do first is I'm going to go to Rena Soutar, who's in Vancouver. And then we'll go sort of across the country, and we'll eventually go across the Atlantic, and we'll find you, Carlos, because you're in Paris. So Rena, if you could start for us, please, just a couple of minutes on what you're seeing, what you think the seminal kinds of issues are, challenges are in your work and in the topic broadly around access to public space.
Sure, thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here, speaking from the ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I just want to say the notion of public parks is foreign to this land. Settler colonialism means that governments took the land for the use of the settlers. And the design and governance of these spaces is carefully curated and communicates who the spaces are for. So the language on the signs, the architecture, the landscape architecture, the permitted activities, the spaces designed for particular kinds of activity, all of those express the culture of the creators and the users. What we choose to support controls who feels comfortable in those spaces. In the times of COVID, decisions get distilled down to those who have always held the power. So there are a lot of quick decisions that need to be made about public space during this time. And those quick decisions filter out the opinions of those whose voices were considered optional. So let's be clear, with overwhelmingly white leadership, times of crisis shake out the people of color and enhance the power of white leadership. So from the top down and the bottom up, we support settler colonial use of public space. We need to actively support other users and decolonize up and down and sideways throughout the governance of public space if we hope to create safe places for people of color.
Thanks, Rena. Let's keep going. We'll come east to Toronto. Cheyenne, would you like to go next? Cheyenne Sundance, then I'll ask Dave. Go ahead, Cheyenne.
Sure. Can you repeat the question, please?
Just an opening comment on what you're seeing in your work in terms of what you think the challenges COVID has presented to equitable access for public spaces and for parks. And you can talk about your work because people probably, don't know much about your work. You can tell us about that too.
Sure. I would say, starting off, my name is Cheyenne Sundance. I run Sundance Harvest, which is a year-round urban farm in Toronto. This is the second year. I have a CSA and I sell at a farmer's market, but I also do food justice education and anti-racist education. Regarding to public parks and what I'm really seeing in probably the urban ag sector with that is lots of people are heading to public parks to chill, hang out, maybe hang out with their families, but also to eat food. So lots of people have been asking me to teach workshops or webinars on foraging, local nuts, berries, all of that stuff. There's been a drastic increase in people understanding the food around them and how to access that. For example, I live near Christie Pitts, which is a park on the west end of Toronto. I usually walk through that park, and I recently saw a friend, and from a distance I said hello, and they said, "Hey, by the way, do you know if there's any nuts or acorns in this park?" And then I showed them the trees that have acorns. More and more people are getting more imaginative about what their parks can do beyond maybe just sitting on grass. So there's service berries in parks, there's acorns, there's even mulberries and crab apples. So I'm seeing more people relating to parks in a different way, whether that be an urban orchard or just foraging for food.
Do you have, we're going to pick up on each thing. You're each touching on things, so I'll come back to you and ask you to talk more about why you think that's happening. Dave, Harvey, can you just give us a kind of context for you and your work at Park People?
And just before I start, I just want to make a shout out. I mean, obviously a great webinar yesterday, but Jay Pitter, who did the webinar yesterday, who organized it, put out a call to courage that was on the CUI website last night, and hopefully you can put it on the chat window there. But I really encourage people to read that. It's great. So I just want to pick up to what Rena said about this challenging time around COVID, and it's shown how essential parks are. I mean, parks are packed like we've never seen them before, and that's such a core part of our urban infrastructure, as important as roads, water, sewers, and it's shining such a light on that. And we've never seen so many people in parks, but at the same time, the points Rena made about the signals that we send out about whether you're welcome or safe in a park, they're twice as confused. Like when people are in, underserviced neighborhoods and some challenged spaces that traditionally can feel unsafe, or they've had some crime issues, safety issues, and then they see warning tape around playgrounds, when they see these signs about what you can do and can't do, when all these rumors around about what's acceptable and not acceptable, we're really setting up some spaces right now where we've never needed them like we've needed them before. but there's just all this uncertainty and confusion, and really recognizing that there's, as we're seeing so many people use parks, there's a lot of people who aren't using parks, and why, and what can we do about it?
Yeah, I guess this is, I mean, there's a thread running through here in terms of what the three of you were talking about how are they designed, how are they used, how are people paying different attention now? Because I guess they got more time on their hands, or they're just so cooped up they want to get out. We'll come back on all these things. Let's let Carlos get in from Paris, a different experience that they're having in Europe. Obviously, Carlos, welcome to us. Go ahead to City Talk.
Hi everyone, my name is Carlos Moreno. I am a scientist. I am the scientific director of the ETI chair at the Sorbonne University, and my research work is oriented for 12 years about the relationships between cities, proximity, and of course public spaces. And I want to share with you my research work about the city of proximities, the 15-minute city, because of this concept with the COVID-19, it's one of the most key elements today for developing cities, in particular in this troubled period. I have a very short video, just 1 minute, 15 seconds, for explain with different images this concept. This is in French with the English subtitles.
La ville du quart d'heure, c'est l'humain au bout d'un. C'est au cœur de la ville, mettre le cœur des hommes. C'est les services de proximité accessibles à tous, à moins d'un quart d'heure, à pied ou en vélo. C'est la nature, la biodiversité, tout près de nous. Des rues piétonnes, des rues végétalisées, moins de circulation. C'est les écoles ouvertes sur les quartiers. La ville des quarts d'heure, c'est un lieu, plusieurs usages. C'est quitter la mobilité subie pour aller vers la mobilité choisie. C'est dire bonjour à tout le monde. C'est des services qui permettent de rendre une ville apaisée. C'est pouvoir vivre plus librement dans la ville, profitant de son quartier. C'est la ville pour tous.
Okay. This is a concept today implemented by the city of Paris, in particular the mayor of Paris. And in the COVID-19 crisis, the city of Milan, the mayor, Giuseppe Sala, announced that his decision for implementing this concept of 15-minute city for developing the new urban plan in the next years in the COVID new urban life.
Thanks, Carlos. And thanks, everybody. You know, you can see a bit of a juxtaposition just here on this panel about different kinds of approaches and where you're each coming from. I think that a question I'd like to ask, and I'll start with Rena if I may, because you work for the city, Rena, so you actually work for a municipality. I'm interested about the extent to which Carlos is talking about a political commitment that was made by a mayor and by a council to provide amenities close to folks, and that there was a public policy commitment to do that. I'm interested in terms of someone like you, Rena, who's working for a municipality, does that work or not? There was a question that was raised before the session began. Someone wrote us and said that Minneapolis was before George Floyd's murder, Minneapolis was given an award by the Trust for Public Land as having a very high park score. But the question is, are these spaces actually doing what urbanists think they can do? So Rena, why don't you start and just give us a sense from your perspective, if you could.
Sure, yeah. I know that the City of Vancouver has followed global trends in trying to provide access to green space to the citizens of the city. And there have been a number of different metrics used over time. I believe that this is all laid out in Van Play, the 25-year playbook for Vancouver Parks and Recreation Services. And one of the things that my colleagues have proposed and got approved for Vancouver is shifting from the notion of just providing space that is close to everyone to targeting historically underserved areas. So they talk about equity zones. And so looking at that, you actually start looking at the unevenness of the types of green space that are being provided. As well, there's a heavier reliance on public green space in places where people don't have access to backyards. You know, the places with the big houses and the big backyards, they're not going to need those green spaces as much. And yet they have the most urban tree canopy in public areas. Yeah. So I think that the City of Vancouver, at least, and I actually report to a separate elected board, which is a bit unique, but their focus now is turning to examining the inequitable distribution of park space.
Dave, I see you nodding your head. You work in parks across the country. Can you comment a bit about what your work and your partner work is doing around the issues that Rena just identified?
Yeah, and that, I mean, we're actually, you know, across Canada, and it's a big generalization, but we're actually generally better than the US in terms of amount of park space that people have access to. There's a better distribution of the number of park space and green spaces, but it's exactly on Rena's point about that. Is it the kind of parks that people actually need to meet their needs? Are they really good parks? Are they safe parks? Are they welcoming parks? Are these just, you know, mounds of basically dirt like that? You know, it's not designed to meet the community's needs. There's nothing happening there. So I think those are far more fundamental questions than, you know, amount of space is helpful. But again, a classic Toronto example is that, you know, we have an incredible ravine system, and it's gorgeous. It's beautiful natural spaces, but a lot of it is very close to some underserviced neighborhoods that have extremely large challenges accessing that. You know, it's very difficult to get down to them. Perhaps it's not a very welcoming place that feels safe. So you can have a lot of park space, but it's actually not meeting the community's needs.
Yeah, I think this is the dilemma. This is what, and as Rena just suggested too, we saw this, and it became, I think, a topic of great tension in urbanism, that it sounded as if only affluent people wanted spaces opened up because they were kind of bored with being inside. And there was just a kind of blindness to the fact that there are people living in all sorts of neighborhoods, in urban communities across the country, that don't have access to anything. So that equity piece became a very painful conversation, I think.
And how much in more privileged neighborhoods, and I speak from that, of that entitlement of that, and that empowerment that can take to go into a space. And these have been complex spaces out there right now. What should I do? What should I do? And you've got to, you know, and there are so many populations across Canada that you're asking a lot of them of, like, just, yes, go down, take your kids into a space that is covered in warning tape and has people looking at you funny of you're doing something wrong. And yeah, we just have to take that into account.
Yeah.
I think we also have to consider,
sorry, Rena, go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to finish up on that topic. I think we also have to consider when we're designing these spaces, and we do talk about, you know, trying to provide access to these spaces, but we end up designing them, and we do so with public input. But the people who talk to us are the people who expect to be heard. We have done no work in earning the trust of the communities who were never heard to begin with. So there are some real internal hurdles. And then when we do try, because we have a white supremacist baseline, that's we're steeped in it, everyone is, it's really difficult to go out and get that information because we're going about it in ways that we don't even realize are problematic and causing further harm. So there's a ton of work to be done as well with regard to just obtaining the kinds of information to learn what difference in public space are people even interested in?
Right.
What would serve them better? They are the ones who have to answer that, and we need to go get those answers.
Yeah, and it's going to vary. It's going to vary what people want. Cheyenne, let's hear from you, because your focus is on, it's on nature and food. It's making that connection, eh?
Yeah,
So
it's more in urban agriculture.
yeah. So can we talk about that? Because it seems to me that might be one of the most important links we could make to people, that parks and public space can be productive.
Yeah, so when we're thinking about, for example, community gardens, in Toronto, where I live, there's lots of community gardens that are situated in public parks. There's also, like I said earlier, lots of urban fruit to be forages too. But when we're thinking about urban agriculture and parks, it's a really nice thought, because an open space, we can really utilize, get rid of that lawn, get in some vegetables, help the pollinators. But a key point that I'm noticing that is really kind of failing or lacking for urban ag and community parks is you actually cannot sell that produce. And this is a big, big, horrible point for folks who are low income, because really, who has access to a backyard? Oftentimes people who are affluent, people who have that extra space, that don't maybe live in high-rise apartments. But when someone's at a community garden, and let's say they have a high-rise apartment they're living in, their balcony really isn't cutting it.
Yeah.
If they can't really sell that food, and let's say they're low income, they're food insecure, food insecurity will not just be alleviated by 4 months of tomatoes. They'll need to actually have income, because food insecurity isn't caused by a lack of food, it's a lack of income. So the big piece about public parks and community gardens, which is often brought up, is it's missing that piece that people who are growing the food can sell it and have like the legality to sell it. Because right now it's against the bylaw. And a lot of the people who kind of come to me for advice for food growing and urban ag and farming, they always mention this point, and they're looking for spaces to grow in the city that they can sell their produce legally. Because let's say someone's also undocumented, or they just don't feel confident navigating bureaucracy and laws. How will they be able to advocate for themselves to sell that food? Probably not. So it really puts low-income people in a very tricky situation. So I would say regarding public parks, community gardens are a great thing, allotment gardens are a great thing, but who has the ability to really be elevated and get out of that food insecure place with those places?
Mm-hmm. We had the mayor of Toronto on this week, and he made this sort of joke. He said, we thought it would take 5 years to get bike lanes passed in Toronto, but we did it in 3 weeks. That COVID is providing an opportunity to get things approved more quickly. Cheyenne, do you think we might see that municipal governments across the country might say, okay, let's change that law so that people could grow in parks? And
I would say that the first thing they need to change is having more allotment gardens over community gardens, because a 4x4 space, you can't really sell much from that. However, an allotment garden that's 10x10 or 20x20, you can sell lots of veg from that. And it would also allow people to get employable skills, right? Agriculture, farming, that's an employable hard skill that you can translate into working on an organic rural farm, or even at a nonprofit in Toronto focused on food. So having someone, giving them the ability to really grow their own food and write that on the resume that they did it for 2 seasons, 4 seasons, can also help them get out of poverty through employment, which is a big thing. So I would say less community gardens, more allotment gardens, because people can still grow food for their family in allotment. They're just given the added option to have space to sell it.
And if I can just add to that too, Mary, that again, and we're talking about large urban centers and things in this talk, but there's lots of spaces in our cities, and how can we find more room to grow food? There's 2 great projects that we're working on in Toronto in Malvern and Flemington on electricity corridors. There's tons of these corridors with so much space, and trying to grow some food there. And the electricity systems, the hydro, they make it extremely difficult. And so let's make some ground there, getting some more space turned into those gardens.
And presumably, go ahead, Cheyenne.
Yeah, jumping on that, from Toronto Urban Growers, we're the group that's really spearheaded that project like 8 years ago. And when you're thinking about how long they've been working on it, I think it was about 8 years, 6 years, as you also know, Dave. It really talks about who we can have as our allies for urban ag. So who is seeing urban ag as an actual part of a resilient food system? And it's really good to see that Food Share is growing in an allotment garden near Flemington Park. So community residents actually can sell their food. So when I'm talking about having an allotment garden, being able to sell it, there's already an example right now. Food share is project with Flemington Park. Residents can grow food and sell it, which is the best of both worlds.
Can I just provide to Cheyenne? You're saying so many interesting things here about food systems, and I think that decolonizing food systems is so critical because of the way that we support community gardens is deeply problematic from the get-go. But I just wanted to provide 2 points that I think, historical points that I think are interesting to note in this light. One is that the park systems and the municipal governments have always controlled who gets to profit off public land. It's not like we don't let anybody profit off public land. We let all kinds of people profit.
Wow.
We permit all kinds of commercial activities. And the other thing is that the federal government introduced the Aboriginal Food Fisheries Act, which the spirit of that really made the assumption that the obtaining of food is simply for sustenance, and that it isn't part of a larger economic system for maintaining your wellness. So I think that there's a strong history in this country of really relegating the people who have to go try to get food, relegating that to, yes, just get food for your family and don't make a business of it because you're not actually allowed to profit.
Right. So there are layers and layers of how this needs to get addressed, but we're back to whether COVID would give us a chance to force the change that you all have probably been advocating for forever. Carlos, can we come to you in terms of your experience in Paris? Is food production on public land or in parks also part of the struggle in Paris that you're talking about?
Yeah, we have several experiences and many projects for the future about the public spaces and the urban agriculture. I think that the most important point today is to share our project in order to develop the new kind of short circuits with the rural territories in the territory of Paris, because we have the city of Paris, one of the most high density the population, and we have the other territory, the Great Paris, and including the rurality. And our project is to create in September or October the new urban agriculture cooperative for developing a short circuit between the urban production, the food, for example, Cheyenne Sundance and other, for increasing the products in city for market, for schools, for the all kind of activities. We need, in fact, to transform the economic models for develop the new services. If you want to create the new relationships, I think that even if we have been developing the urban agriculture in the city of Paris, inside the Paris, this is especially for developing the social link, but it's not possible to develop the real food actions. This is more than create a social link to develop the social inclusion, for developing pedagogical actions for kids with the schools. But the real strategy for creating the new economic circuits based on food is this idea to build this grid urban agriculture cooperative. The name is Agri-Paris, this is the name, because this is the new economic model, because this Agri-Paris will be a subsidiary of the city of Paris with the agreements with the different local farmers, producers, in particular the young producers, the young farmers in the rural areas close to Paris. 20 minutes, 1 hour, in order to develop this idea of the grid metropolises, to break the control by the commercial production and to promoting the citizen empowerment, in fact, by the young farmers.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Carlos. It's really valuable, I think, for Canadian urbanists and urban practitioners to hear experiences from other places. And we also I always want to acknowledge we probably have at least 3 people here that where English is not their first language, or certainly maybe 2. But so it's good for us to listen carefully to one another. And Carlos, we appreciate you working in your second language. Thank you. Can I go back to Cheyenne for a sec? In terms of the point that Carlos just made, we have cities in Canada also, like Paris, that have within their boundaries have large rural spaces. We had the mayor of Ottawa on last week, and he had an assistant come into the frame and show the map of Ottawa and how the kilometers that are covered are enormous. And Halifax is the same. They have a lot of rural areas within their municipal boundary, unlike Vancouver, I don't think, Rena, where it's pretty tight. And so I'm curious about, from your point of view, Cheyenne, do you think that we could get to a place where, for instance, you work in Toronto, where the 905, the communities around Toronto, could there be some kind of collaboration, like Carlos was just implying, with the outer part of the region around urban ag? Have you had that conversation with colleagues yet in other places?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So lots of colleagues of mine are constantly thinking about ways to connect rural farming to urban farming, because both are needed for a resilient food system. But the biggest piece regarding rural farming is it's simply not that accessible. It's much, much easier to grow lots of food, obviously, in a rural space when you have acres and acres, but really who gets the privilege and opportunity to be able to farm that land? Black and Indigenous people are statistically the most oppressed in the food system, and we're talking about food insecurity all across Canada. There's many studies that recently came out about this. So those youth that I primarily work at with Sundance Harvest don't have like a car, they don't have intergenerational wealth, they don't have grandparents who are settlers who own land so they can go out into these rural areas. So oftentimes the connections that are being made are simply connections that are only, I would say, baseline around food growing. So there's not a lot of talk currently, and I think that it would be a really good opportunity to have a talk and maybe even a conference or something about rural farming and urban farming, and seeing which ways that rural farmers can actually share these resources, and a lot of these resources that they've gained through their privilege and intergenerational wealth with Indigenous youth in Toronto, with Indigenous youth nearby the nations that they are at, with Black youth, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think that that conversation needs to be there, but the key piece about who has the privilege to farm rurally and who simply has to just stick to urban Toronto, like myself, really needs to come into play. And I do think that, for example, one of the big things for urban farmers in Toronto is when they're selling at a farmer's market or even a wholesaler CSA, not having enough produce. You can really only grow so much on a small plot of land. You can really try, but you can really only grow so much. For me, I have a 40-person CSA, which is a pretty wild thing when you're thinking about how big my greenhouse is. But for rural farmers, they usually have 120 people. Right. So figuring out ways to even make a cooperative model where rural farmers can sell produce with urban farmers and maybe making that a green belt initiative. That's another example. So I feel like finding ways to connect youth who are dispossessed or youth who are oppressed within the food system to rural land and having an experience to really get rooted in nature and maybe heal from the legacy of colonialism with their elders in nearby nations, and also maybe a way that rural farmers and urban farmers can figure out selling cooperative or a way to sell food together to really heighten what the local food system can do.
Rena, do you see, just a sec, Dave, Rena, do you see there's a question in the chat here about someone asking it's Jesse Best, thanks Jesse, anybody with experience around Indigenous protected areas, any similar work in urban areas, and could this be a model for a decolonized governance model for urban parks? Anybody thinking like that out your way?
A bit of a different context here. Well, possibly not, actually. I don't know about every other city, but there are areas that are not officially protected, but that the park board has become aware are incredibly archaeologically sensitive.
Mm-hmm.
And the continued use by people who aren't aware of that can really impact the archaeological remains there. And with so little left of the evidence of the thousands of years of occupation here for the ancestors, or for the descendants who are still living here, this is a real problem. So there are some areas that we're looking at protecting, but for a bit of a different reason than ecological sensitivity. And we are hoping to move towards we're trying to work with the local nations on stewardship, because their approach to stewardship is, you know, they've been doing stewardship work for forever, but that's also just a starting point for honoring their unceded territory, honoring their rights to have decision-making power in these lands. They should be able to weigh in on who gets to profit off of selling food, who gets to profit off of the public land. They should have decisions about all of these things. So discussions about Indigenous stewardship are important, but that is really basic. And that's kind of an entry point for including the local Indigenous peoples and their knowledge and expertise. We need to recognize that they know this land better than anybody. And there are a whole host of decisions aside from just stewardship and environmental protection that they need to weigh in on.
Mm-hmm. The chat's getting lots of energy here for the number of things you guys are raising, and including this call that Cheyenne offered initially around, can't we get more allotment gardens? And the piece that you raised, Rena, about don't we have to completely rethink the governance model? Dave, do you want to weigh in on either of those things? You do work across the country.
Or bring them together.
Or bring them together, yes.
Well, so I think there's some interesting opportunities. You know, two examples with Rouge Park near Toronto. You know, it includes parts in the city of Toronto, but it's, you know, it's 20,000 acres. And so I know Parks Canada, you know, is trying on Indigenous, like to make it a real opportunity for a showcase, but like to try things differently in something that's so close to an urban center, you know, so close to Toronto, and think about governance differently. I know it's early days, but then also on the agricultural side, traditionally a lot of that land, more extremely recently, was farmland. And so part of the vision for the park is to keep that land farmland. And how could that land be used more creatively than just, you know, 100-acre allotments for growing industrial corn? So thinking about that, and the same with Montreal, the Grand Park to the west. Again, part of the vision there of this, you know, very large green space that, you know, it's a 20-year vision to how to create this park in Montreal, is for, you know, long-term agricultural opportunities there. So, you know, it's how we can think about, it's not a, you know, a little allotment garden or a community garden, but this can be large-scale agriculture with that, and you know, and getting our park system as part of that.
And somehow coordinate. Can I just remind the participants, lots of really great things going into the chat, but could you direct them, please? Like Rhonda, you just put something in, but just to panelists. Can you redirect it to repost, if you can, all panelists and everyone, so that everybody sees these things, it gets recorded. Carlos, I'm wondering if we can go back to you. You presented it off the top with a kind of aspiration and reflecting a commitment that was made from the top down, about a goal that you obviously feel is an instrument to get change. I'm assuming that you feel like you can get a city government to make a commitment to change, to make, it's almost like you're suggesting it's an entitlement. People should have an accessible park 15 minutes from their house, right? Or their home, wherever they are. I guess the question that we struggle with here in Canada is that enough? Is that actually, just the provision of that, going to be adequate to actually giving people what they need, if it just comes from the top down, you know?
Yes, of course. Today in the city of Paris, we wanted to develop this concept of the proximity for inhabitants. in order to access at the 6 urban essential social functions to live, to work, to care, to supply, to learn, to enjoy. This is a new paradigm because we wanted to reduce the mass transportation. We wanted to develop the peaceful streets. We wanted to ban diesel cars at the horizon 2024. We wanted to develop the urban urban park.
Carlos, we should just tell you that there are lots of urban advocates in Canada that have Paris envy for how bold Paris is being about cars and not making room for cars. So we appreciate the efforts you're making. We haven't been, I don't think, as successful in Canada yet at reducing cars in cities, but you carry on. So carry on with what you were suggesting.
It's very important for us because the key element for transforming the city today with all kinds of car only for a few people into the car, we need to have the peaceful streets for developing the garden, for the square, digitalization, to develop the water for benefit kids in the school, for open the schools on the street. We need to develop the market in the proximity, to develop the one-point shop. This is the new approach, in fact, if we wanted to develop the really a strong social inclusion. So we wanted to develop the new economic models. We wanted to develop the short circuits, the circular economy. And this is necessary today for us to including the urban parks, the areas of green activities. This is the case when the Mayor of Paris decided to ban the diesel cars of the motor highway along the Seine River for transforming in the nice urban park. And today, this is the urban park at the heart of Paris. We need today transform the urban park by the proximity with the possibility to include in the park other kind of new services. We want to develop the citizen kiosk in the park. The citizen kiosk, in fact, this is the new style for the local administration. The people today must go to the town hall. If we have the possibility to install, for example, in the green areas, in the urban park, the citizen kiosk with the local governance, we could develop a new relationship with the citizens and the local authority. We could develop, for example, the project with the participatory budgets in order to increase the green areas for people, the possibility to use the temporary urbanism, the tactical urbanism, for transforming places, for transforming streets during 6 months, for example, or 1 year. And because this is only temporary, but this is the possibility for promoting the civic empowerment, the civic commitment. This is the concept of Topophilia, the possibility for allowing the possibility for each one of citizens to create, to propose the new project with the condition for improving the quality of life in the proximity, in the 15 minutes around at home. This is the possibility for
it's not just in the park. What happens in the park, then
in the district,
it bleeds out. What was the word you used? Something philia. I heard the philia.
The Topophilia.
Topophilia.
The Topophilia, this is the concept for love of the places. Topophilia. Topophilia, this is a very important concept born in Latin America because in the slum, this is the way for people to develop the new urbanities. Love my places, love my street, love my garden. This is very important for people be proud of this place.
Yeah. I wonder if we can get to loving our place so it doesn't have to just feel like my place, you know. Rena, can I just ask you about this notion of democratizing parks or public spaces and I can't say it, decolonizing.
Colonizing.
Thank you, decolonizing and decolonializing. Do you have models in Vancouver? You know, Carlos is talking about a big ambitious plan. Paris has a long history of this kind of approach to planning its spaces. Do you think that in Vancouver, have you been able to, I mean, I've been in the Strathcona Park and I know that the various users of that Strathcona Park have navigated with the Carnegie Library, Community Center, and various stewards, and they've sort of found a way to share different things. Do you have further thoughts on that about, is there an opportunity for us to do this differently?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think we don't have an alternative, actually. We have to figure out how to do this. But I think there's a huge range, and I don't think that there's a one-size-fits-all solution to any one space. All of Canada, all of the US, all of North America is unceded Indigenous territory. It was all taken without the free, prior, and informed consent. I don't think any Indigenous person said, yeah, no, I'll sell it all over to you and then go live on this little spot. That's cool. Awesome.
Yeah.
So I want to start from that point. It is all unceded. And in Vancouver, we've officially said that it's unceded territory. So whenever we're dealing with space planning and trying to figure out how to allocate specific uses, so how do we support food sovereignty? How do we support sports users? How do we support all of these different things in parks? There's a huge range of possibilities for any given piece of land. On the one hand, we've got give the land back. That's always a possibility. We govern the land, we hold it in most cases. There's some weird jurisdictional things. Sometimes we lease it, but there's always a possibility to give it back. And at the other end, it's go ahead and just serve the inhabitants without any consideration of Indigenous use and the long history of the rights holders, Indigenous rights holders. Just go ahead and plan as we always used to. And somewhere in between, there's a lot of other options. And so in places like Strathcona, we're looking at, designating parcels of land for Indigenous cultural practice, whatever that looks like, because our silos don't actually fit most Indigenous cultural practice anyway. If you're going to be doing Indigenous food sovereignty work, that also probably includes a lot of wellness work, a lot of artistic practice, a lot of traditional practice. All of those things, they don't fit into our silos. So we're looking at ways of figuring out how to designate pieces of land for Indigenous cultural use and try, at the same time as trying to encourage and develop the relationships with Indigenous cultural practitioners, and then center those people for their knowledge and expertise and allow them to lead that work. So basically provide our resources and space and get out of the way. We're also looking at, in other places, trying to figure out how to honor and acknowledge the fact that, these were old village sites and the narrative has been completely erased. So how do we work with the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh rights holders to restore some control over that place, or, all kinds of issues? How do we communicate to the public that this is unceded Indigenous territory? How does the public even know when they're standing on an old village site? We've erased it. Parks has erased it. We have jurisdiction over those lands. We're responsible for the fact that there's no narrative there. So we also have to deal with that. So there's a huge range of possibilities for all of these different spaces. And I think that what we're trying to do, and I don't want to position us as being, really exceptional at doing the very best job at any of these things. We're trying to ask the questions and probably doing it badly. But, by starting to ask the questions, hopefully we can build the trust and relationships and continue to do better. So hopefully in that range of not consulting and giving the land back, we shift over this way.
Yeah, into it somewhere. A question in the chat asking if you would just provide a bit more detail, if you could briefly, on the Point Grey process. Does that mean something to you? Something comes, the development in Point Grey. Could you speak a bit more to your knowledge about that process, if you could? Do you know that process? Rena?
Oh, sorry, I missed the question.
Okay. It's someone in the chat has asked a question about detail about the Point Grey process. Does that mean something to you?
Point Grey? No.
Oh, I thought it was in Vancouver. Sorry, Becca Myers. I
No,
thought it was.
Point Grey is in Vancouver. I'm just not quite sure what they're talking about. Is
Yeah.
it the Jericho Locarno
First thing comes to mind, development Point Grey. Could you speak a bit more to your knowledge about that process if you could?
Oh, is this the Jericho lands development?
We'll see if that's what.
Yes.
Is that what it is?
Okay, the Jericho lands development, there's some really, really fascinating things going on in Vancouver right now. And this is very much the Indigenous people, the local Indigenous people got, this is my perspective. This is my opinion of the, I'm not speaking for the local nations at all. But as a Haida person, not from these territories, I'm looking at it going, they waited forever for some acknowledgement that this is their territory. And they finally said, fine, we'll do it your way. Got pooled all of their resources, created Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Development Corporation, that's the MST DevCorp, and purchased the land back. Did it in the settler colonial way, just bought it back, and they're developing. It's resulted in some really interesting relationships where the City of Vancouver would usually make all kinds of demands from developers to say, put this on there, this on there, this on there, but realizing that they've had to just purchase their own territory back from the feds, we're hesitant to just put all of those demands. So it's like the governance of these and the usual regulations are having to be reconsidered. I don't know what more I can say on that because they're not park spaces, but from a parks perspective, I will say that we are perfectly aware that going to a developer, a local Indigenous rights holder developer, and saying you must have this amount of parks for the new residents is not really the way to go. I can get into all of that into more detail, but I don't think this is a forum for that.
I mean, and the dilemma we've got is that we're advocating, I think all of us advocate for public space. We want publicly shared and accessible space. David, go ahead.
Well, but an element around that, Rena, just to pick up on that, is that I think we'd all agree that the COVID experience and so much demand for public spaces and great public spaces and public spaces that meet community needs really shows that we need to do a better job of that in our cities, of providing all those things. And very worried that municipal governments are really going to hit a crunch financially in the coming years too. And what's that going to mean for our park budgets, and what's that going to mean for park acquisition and programming and all the good things that we care about? So very concerned about that. And so and get to these questions of how much are developers paying for parks, how much how are we in new neighborhoods, are we doing enough for the parks that should be part of that? Can we find new and creative ideas to meet people's park needs from developers, from others? Can we were talking about electricity corridors before for growing food. Can we use more of that for linear parks, like in Toronto with the Meadowway project? So how can we, we've got to do better, and in a time when government's going to have less money, of meeting our park needs.
I would be really remiss, actually, if I didn't raise the subject right now that there is a broader public discussion about municipal budgets and where that money might come from. I don't think that this is the forum to be weighing in on that, but having just recently seen the Vancouver budget and the proportion of police funding versus parks funding versus everything else, I think that there are other factors that determine parks funding than just the amount that we were already allocated and how some of the revenue streams have gone down because of COVID.
And there's obviously, we've had a number of city talks here raising the fact that municipal revenues are significant in Canada. Carlos, for your benefit, municipalities here, their only source of revenue is property tax and user fees. And those have been drastically cut by the budget, by the COVID. But now Rena is raising the point too, that even within the envelope that municipal governments have, the money they do spend, as someone said, if you want to see someone's values, go look at the budget. And when you look at our budget, you see that it is tilted very much in favor of a particular kind of style of organizing society, and that's all under question, and the chat box is exploding, Rena, since you raised this point. So is this one of these COVID moments where we're going to have a serious reconsideration of how we prioritize our public funds? And as Dave suggested, probably you could argue parks were underfunded beforehand, even from a maintenance point of view, let alone what you want to do with parks.
It's not probably, you can argue that.
That they've been chronically underfunded for a number of years. So do we have a moment now, after everyone has been besieged with, we need our parks, we need our public space, and then Cheyenne, you've been adding a whole new piece to it, that it could be about economic livelihood, it's about survival. Does that mean we come out of COVID with a renewed commitment to quality of life and budgeting for quality of life? Cheyenne, we've only got a few more minutes, so I'm going to go around the room once more and just ask for closing comments. But Cheyenne, let's go to you first. You've been making a passionate case here for food and the role of food production. Do you want to add anything more to that about the moment we've got here after COVID?
Sure. I think the moment we got here after COVID really is going to display how we view humanity and those who don't have access to privileges, such as being affluent, race privilege, and those who are often overpoliced. I truly think that parks are a place where a lot of change can happen. From what I spoke about earlier, economic development, people actually getting these hard skills to get employable jobs, food, access to self-employed income, right? There's a bunch of things that I think that parks can provide. And I truly think that proper funding in parks is very important. And also parks can be a preventative measure, right? I believe in defunding the police, and really putting those funds toward parks could allow folks who are overly policed and face police brutality, so largely Black and Indigenous people, to have a place to go, have a place to grow food, sell food, and really get themselves out of poverty if they can. And that's a very hard thing to do coming from someone who lived in poverty as a child. So I would say that parks can be a place where you can really bring people together, but it's also a place of division. Parks are heavily policed. Where I grew up, there's always a police officer walking around that park. And also thinking about who feels safe in a park. So I feel like going forward, I think urban agriculture needs to have a permanent stake in parks. I feel like with the lack of land space to grow food, parks are an obvious solution. But I also think that thinking about how parks can be more than leisure is a very important thing, because people who think parks are just a place to, I don't know, have a beer at Trinity Bellwoods on a Sunday are people who often aren't affected by systemic issues such as racism or poverty, and those type of issues. So seeing parks in a different light, I feel like could really catalyze change in Toronto and also internationally.
Yeah, it could be a transformer, can't it? A new imagining of what parks could be. Carlos, 1 minute to you, and then we'll keep going around. 1 minute in closing.
Yeah. I want to share with you this point of view. Public spaces is before all public. In Paris, this is a public service. This is very important because this is the space for all. This is a very important place of the city for fighting against inequities, for promoting social inclusion, for promoting developing the new projects, for a new economics model, for new services. And this is in a very strategic action of the local governance. Our budget, the budget of the city of Paris, including the very intensive action for increasing the activity in the public space. And this is today one of the axes if we wanted to develop the inclusive city. We cannot have an inclusive city without public spaces free for all, and the possibility for developing all kinds of activities. The public space is not only to have the free entrance. The public space is a reality when we have the possibility to develop the activities in these places. The music, cultural activities, artistic, to playground for kids, to all kinds of sportive activities, etc. For that, we wanted to foster people to use the participatory budget for improving the public space, because it's the possibility for increasing activities inside the public space. I think that public space is one of the most important points for mixing people, for fight against racism, for promoting democracy, for promoting the equity, for develop the new pedagogical attitudes for the school, for the education. This is the strategic point of cities. This is not only the green areas. We need to have, of course, the green areas, but the most important point is to do in these green areas the social activities for developing the social inclusion and the new economic model for all. This is the concept, the cities for all.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Carlos. A minute to you, Dave Harvey, and then we'll go to Rena to take us home.
Well, I'll keep it really short. So I just want to, like Cheyenne, you hit it so well. And I think this is just, we mentioned earlier, it's a time like parks have never been in the spotlight more, and it's a great thing. And so it shows how much critical parks are. And we just talked about resources, and we need more and better resource for parks. But fundamentally too, and going back to a comment Rena made earlier about voices and who's being heard and who's not being heard, we need new voices and we need to hear those voices, and this is a time for that. So I'll shut up.
Rena, last word to you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I think that the most urgent thing we have to deal with right now is racism. It is at the core of all of the problems. In park space, it isn't just the governance, it is the users. So I think that we need to really consider how we're communicating who is welcome in these public spaces. How do we use those public spaces? One of the ways that we could communicate that is by supporting Indigenous food sovereignty in parks more. I think that people could really learn from the presence of that and witnessing it, even if they're not participating. So I think that we really need to, in the same way that, you know, trans people welcome signs on a bathroom, don't actually ensure that trans people aren't going to experience bigotry in those bathrooms, but it does communicate to the bigots that their management does not have their back. How do we do that in parks? How do we tell the entire public that we are protecting these spaces for people of color, for Indigenous people, for Black people? Your bigotry isn't welcome in these spaces. How do we do that?
Yes, well, on that very, very crucial and profound challenge, thank you everyone for joining us on this and giving us so much to think about. You can see in the chat, people are expressing their appreciation for all the issues you've raised. And it's a very effective follow-up to the conversation we had yesterday, where we're just, as we've suggested, this is an ongoing conversation about what are the challenges that COVID is presenting to us that we need to take seriously and fix. And you just, all of you made that very clear around how we need to double down on how do we make sure that public spaces and parks work for everyone. Thanks everybody for joining us at City Talk. Thank you, Rena. Thank you, Carlos, for coming in from Paris. Thank you, Cheyenne, from beautiful downtown Toronto, and Dave Harvey, also from downtown Toronto. It's the beginning of several conversations. Please continue the chat, guys, on hashtag City Talk. We'll post this later today. And also, just to remind people that tomorrow we're back for one more City Talk this week with Moreno from Calgary, who's going to raise, I'm sure, and respond to a lot of the issues that you folks have raised today. And then a week tomorrow, COVID 100. Mark your calendars now. Thanks again for joining us, everybody. Really very appreciative conversation. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.